I've spent many years optimizing my study techniques so that I can improve my marks and improve my grades and keep achieving academically. And this has resulted in me getting 100% for maths and matric, being the duck student at my school, having an average of 93%, and then coming into varsity and studying actuarial science in UCT in South Africa, and being the top student in my first 2 years of studies. And it's these fundamental things that I'm about to share with you that have really aided me in this process in my academic journey and have ensured my success. So there's obviously things that I learn along the way that make minor differences over short periods of time, but these things that I'm going to share with you today are the things that have made the impact in the long term, the things that continue to make an impact, and are the things that I can really swear by. So I've broken them down into 3 categories for you, and all of them target particular problems that a lot of students have. So the first one being time management, and I have a couple of tips there for you. The second one being study techniques, and taking you from the process of not knowing anything to being able to answer complex questions and get it right most of the time. And then the third one is about mindset and distinguishing these false assumptions that you may have about yourself, or that hold you back on a day-to-day basis, or just in general trying to optimize your mental approach and your attitude in tests and approaching tests. Okay, so let's start with time management. So the first thing that's made a massive difference is tracking. Now, there's many ways that you can do this, and the one way that I'm doing most often is actually recommended by Ali Abdaal. I'll link that video. And what he says is to use a Google Doc, and you can just open a new Google Doc on your browser, just go docs.new, enter, and it opens a new Google Doc, and you can just start typing immediately. Now, if you type in at and then now and enter, it'll put in the date and time, and then you can, below that, type in what you did in the previous time. So what I do is I'll say at now, and it'll type in the date and time, and then I'll say 1 hour contingencies tutorial. Or later in the day I'll go at now, enter 2 hours this. And then at the end of the day, you can see how much work you've got done. You can see where your weak areas are in the day, where you were most productive, and then you can try and learn things from this so that you can optimize your own studying. Now, another technique that you could use is just have like a spreadsheet, and every time you study, enter in one column the time that you spent studying, and then in another column what you did, and then at the end of the day you can total that time. And then over, let's say, a month, you might have certain days that went well and certain days that didn't go so well, and you can learn from that, and each day you can reiterate on your processes. Then another thing that's really, really important in terms of time management is time blocking, or just in general planning. Now, this is one that is pretty much self-explanatory, so I'm not going to go and tell you how you should time block or what time blocking is. Perhaps I'll give a brief explanation, but I want to focus on the things that made it ineffective for me and how I overcame those. So the first thing, so just briefly, time blocking is you put in your calendar, from this time to this time I'm going to do this work or this thing, and then having a little bit of blank space so that you can have a mental shift into the next task or break, so that you can come back refreshed for the next block of time of work. And you do that throughout your whole day. Now, my problem was I left no blank spaces, and that meant that switching between tasks, I had attention residue, which meant that I couldn't fully switch over. And often what happens is you're doing something and you don't want to just drop it right there. You want to finish your thought, make sure that you're leaving this thing in a place that's responsible so that you can come back to it and attend to your thoughts correctly, as opposed to stopping, put your pen down there and go to the next thing as the time runs out. That's an ineffective way to do it. So leaving some space so that you can transition into the next bit of work that you're going to do. And then another thing was over planning. I'd over plan this, and I'd have my day to the minute from the time I wake up to the time I go to bed. And the problem with this is that by midway through the day, it's already gone to shit. Everything's off track, and something small has happened, partly because of that attention residue problem that I was experiencing. And then I'm in the bin because I don't actually know what to do anymore, and I end up abandoning the timetable. So I've found the best way to do it is to time block or plan twice a day. So once at the start of the day, as you wake up, you plan your morning, or maybe it'll go briefly into the afternoon, and then you can reset and replan for your evening session. So it breaks the day into two so that you can actually account for the randomness of the day, or the randomness, things that occur that you can't plan for. So the last thing with time management I want to talk about is ultimate prioritization. So in terms of what I mean by this is, yes, you can say, this is my to-do list, and I want to do this, I want to do this, I want to do this. And then, okay, this one's probably more pertinent because it's due in 3 days' time. So I'll start with that. Like that's all good and well, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about at university, for example, you have courses. And let's say your goal is to get the highest GPA possible. You have courses, certain of them count different credits, and certain assessments within each course count greater, or have a greater percentage of the mark. So like exams typically count 70 or 60%, whereas a tutorial assessment might count 3%. And obviously then it makes sense to spend more time on the exam than the tutorial assessment. So just by saying that, what I really want you to do is look at the credits of a course and choose the course that has the greatest credit weighting, and really make sure that that is the course that you're going to nail. That's the course that needs to get smashed. Then, within each of your courses, you look at what counts the most towards that course. Typically, it's going to be the exam, and that means you start the semester with the exam in mind, and you start the semester going through tests, learning from these tutorial assessments, and breaking your studying and all that down so that eventually, by the exam, you're so good you can smash that exam. But it's all a process that you have to lead up to that. And these other things in the interim, let's say you have an essay worth 10%, and that's going to take, let's say, if you want to really do well in it or put in a lot of effort, you're going to put in 15 hours of your time. Now, I would argue that if you could cut that 15 hours back to 7.5, and maybe your mark drops by 10 to even 20%, that's okay, because 20% of 10% is only 2%. But if you spend 7.5 hours extra studying for the exam by doing 2 extra past papers and learning from them, then you might gain an extra 10% on your exam, and the exam counts 70%, so you're actually gaining 7%. So you lose 2% there, gain 7% there, you're in a 5% surplus. Okay, so that's with time management. We have time blocking, we have tracking, and we have this ultimate prioritization. Now let's get to study techniques. Okay, so studying happens in 3 stages, from the point where you know nothing to the point where you're ready for any question that can come up in a test. So the first stage is understanding, some people call it encoding, the learning of the information. There's no point in doing active recall, spaced repetition, all these other things that are often talked about if you don't have the information to start with. So you have to learn it, you have to understand it. So that's the first thing that you're going to focus on. And I'll get to the technique that I think is most beneficial from that. Then after that, you're going to have to practice, and that's what you do with your active recall and spaced repetition. You can build your practice into those frameworks. So the practicing part deepens your knowledge and makes connections and tests it, and the actual act of retrieving information is what strengthens that connection, so that in your tests you're able to retrieve the information more effectively. And then the final one is the memorization. Now, I'm hesitant to call it memorization because everyone knows it's a bad idea to rote learn, parrot learning. That's like the one frowned upon thing to do. But if you set yourself up where you've done the understanding and the practice first, then this last thing, instead of abandoning it like a lot of people do, and then they go and they might understand, but they forget facts, you got to make sure that you know everything. So you memorize things, you memorize facts, you memorize formulae, you memorize all these things that maybe it's difficult to build into a greater network. So maybe you have the idea of a formula for that represents an annuity, say. It's just a convenient example for me because studying actuarial science. So an annuity has a certain, you can fit that into your framework in actuarial science or financial maths, and it makes sense what that is. But then come test time, you don't actually know how to use it because you can't remember the formula. Now that's stupid. So obviously practicing means you deal with the formula a lot. That's helpful. But now make sure you really know it so that when you have to apply these things in the test, you don't get tripped up over something small by using a negative exponent instead of a positive exponent. So make sure that right before the test, when I mean right before, I mean like the day's approaching, you're really consolidating the memorization and you know everything back to front. And memorizing not just these smaller concepts and facts, but also memorizing the understanding and these blocks that you've made so that everything makes sense in your head. So rather solidifying, ingraining that, that's also a type of memorization. Now, the way to understand or to learn this information in the first place that I think is best, and I learned from Justin Sung's YouTube channel, is interleaving. So the way that you do this is at the start of the semester or at the start of a week of learning or start of a course, you can front load. And what you do then with this front loading is you cover the entire semester's work, not in much detail, but what you're doing there is you're forming nodes and you're grouping these nodes and you're making mental connections and you are chunking and you're having ideas that fit together well. And then with these ideas, you go through the semester's work again. Now, obviously, it's tough. It's tough to start and in a week, assume that you could get through the entire semester's work, but you can actually do it. So in a week, you cover everything, not in detail, and accept that. You cover everything though, and you create these nodes, and you create a framework, a high-level picture that lacks clarity, and accept that in the first week or however long it takes, depending on the amount of content. Then, second week, you can go back in and you can start to connect some of the nodes, connect these bigger concepts. Maybe you realize that maybe you chunked things that weren't well chunked and didn't really relate. So you start to reorganize your thoughts and your ideas, and this higher level picture starts to gain some clarity. And in the week following that, you reiterate on that process, and then you fill in the details. And by the 5th, 6th week of doing this, you understand everything in quite a deep place and a low-level picture. You have low-level resolution on this idea of the course and what it's trying to teach you, as opposed to being at, let's say, week 6 of a 12-week semester and only covered half the work in detail in a linear fashion that doesn't necessarily match your learning style. And then after this, you haven't actually formed any connection, so you just have a lot of loose facts hanging around, which don't really link to anything else, and those are a lot harder to retrieve and a lot harder to make sense of in the greater framework of what you're actually trying to learn, what they're actually trying to teach you. Okay, now the third thing is mindset. So I think I want to talk about 3 things with mindset. So the first one is having an identity shift, and what I mean by this is no longer accepting the fact that you're an average or poor student and introducing these techniques that I've taught you and then using them consistently so that eventually you lead to a place where your marks start to increase, and that gives you hope. And then slowly, your identity can start to change with this. Your identity can start to change with your processes. Now, I'm not just going to say to you, the best way to improve your identity is to visualization and journaling. Although these things can help and I do recommend them, that's not the way to do it. You get your systems in place, you get your time management in place, you rely on these systems and you commit to them. And then over time, you get better at the execution and your identity does change. And then you start to see the results of this new identity, and that simply solidifies the identity. And you keep doing this. And before you know it, you are a top student and you are achieving as top students do. Okay, so that's the identity change that's going to have to take place. And then the second one is a test mentality. So, or a big match temperament, as some people like to call it, where instead of now freaking out before the test, flipping through pages right before you're about to write a test or an exam, and worrying that you're going to be able to retrieve things, and I don't really understand this that well, and worrying about your studying, did I do enough, have I done enough practice, all that's done. All that's done, you can't think about it anymore, and in fact also try and avoid other people, that your friends maybe, that might be asking you questions or adding to the anxiety of the situation. So try and isolate yourself before tests and focus on breath work so that you can come to terms with what's about to happen. You're about to go write a test and you're starting to calm yourself down into a mental state that's relaxed and focused and fully mindful and present. So the idea with writing tests is you don't want to blast music, let's say, before you write a test, because that can amp you up and hype you up, and then you make small mistakes. You don't want to do that. And you also don't want to go into this test like a sloth. You don't want to go in there all lethargic and then not finish the test. That's also really stupid. You have to go into this test in a calm, calculated, and quick reactive manner. So like a precision sniper. You there in a calm state and you ready to pull the trigger at things and be focused and really nail this test in a disciplined and mindful manner. I think maybe that's the best way to put it. So make sure that you can isolate yourself before the tests, center yourself, relax, be calm, and accept certain emotions that may arise within you before test, anxiety, these things. What I'm saying is you don't have to dispel these. You don't have to go in the test completely like a blank slate, completely free of all these problems. You don't have to do that, because oftentimes trying to do that creates more anxiety. So instead of creating more anxiety, just accepting your current state and knowing that everything that you've put into place, or all the work that you've done is going to come together in this test, and you're just going to do your best. Now, don't excuse yourself and say all the work is done. No, not all the work is done. You still have to write the test. So make sure that you're in a mental frame to just write the test, but don't stress yourself out too much about it. And then the third thing with mindset, and this is the last thing I'm going to talk about in the video, it's really, really important, is to make sure that you distinguish this brainwashing that you have about yourself, false assumptions, misconceptions, preconceptions, whatever the hell you want to call it, that are holding you back. And these misconceptions, preconceptions can take many different forms and infiltrate all parts of your studying and academic journey. Now, I'll give you some examples of things that you need to dispel. So let's say you're introducing a new system into your studying, and this system is not effective and it's not working for whatever reason. Now, instead of kicking it out and saying, oh no, it just doesn't work for me, or this keeps on happening, instead of doing that, realize that maybe it's just that you don't really know yet how to implement the system properly. You haven't mastered that system, and the problem is just that you have to sit with the system for a while and get good at it before it starts yielding results. Don't expect systems to necessarily yield results on the first day. Just as after watching this video you may have a lot of ideas to go and try. Don't expect them all to work immediately, but at least put systems in place and commit to them so that you can eventually grow into these systems and grow into these habits or these ideas that you've made that can help you grow into a better student. So kicking off these false ideas that, oh, the system just doesn't work for me. Be very careful of saying something like that. Or be very careful of saying, another example of a false misconception that people have is, oh, I'm just not a top student. Learning's not really for me. I've never really been good at it. Or I'm not that intelligent. Or I lack discipline. Be very, very careful of saying these things about yourself, because they become self-fulfilling prophecies and you end up holding yourself back. And in reality, a lot of the time, they're not actually true. And most of the time, these systems and things that we put in place aren't really the most effective things at play. And we like to think that these systems can help us move away from willpower and discipline, which is true. They can help us move away from willpower and discipline. And that's good in the sense that we have to rely on them less so we can be more successful in the long term. But the problem with that, moving away from willpower and discipline, is that you start to think that it's something that shouldn't be relied upon. And a lot of things take some sort of activation energy or overcoming the static friction so that you can get going. And that does often require a little bit of discipline and a little bit of willpower. No system is going to get you straight out of bed to sit at your desk and start working. There's no such system that exists. And maybe habits can exist, but you've got to first get yourself out of bed, and that does rely on willpower and discipline. So don't just assume that, I lack discipline or I lack willpower or whatever it is, and acknowledge that maybe it's just a small amount of discipline that I need to put in to get going, and once I'm going, things run a lot more smoothly. Yeah, so that's all I really wanted to talk about in this video. Let me know what you think. Let me know if any of these things are going to help you. And thanks for watching.